Welcome to Truth Telling with Elizabeth D'Alto, the podcast dedicated to focusing on the truth that is always evolving within us and around us, where we explore the potentiality of truth as a highly esteemed value at a time in history when most people have more on their plates than any one human should. If you're new to me, full expression is my jam. Some words people have used to describe me range from speaker, trainer, coach, healer, writer, spiritual advisor, teacher, podcaster, and someone even called me their soul Sherpa once. I'm less concerned with titles or labels and more interested in results, change, and creating a world we want to, can, and are proud to live in. A kinder, gentler, more curious, collaborative, reverent world where people respect each other's backgrounds, experiences, and truths. They trust in themselves, in life, and recognize that we need each other. And they know how to cultivate healthy relationships to true power, not the very unhealthy kind of power our current culture is predicated upon. Speaking of our culture, there's a lot of noise and ignorance in our current culture, and this show aims to cut through that by exploring the truths of a diverse range of incredible voices. From authors, artists, creatives, and educators to activists, speakers, and those in various scientific and esoteric fields, our guests hail from cultures and countries all over the world. We post a new interview every Monday, and if you want to keep up with the show notes and quotes from our guests, you can follow me on Instagram at Elizabeth D'Alto. You can expect a wide range of topics when you tune into this show. Everything from health, communication, money, success, parenting, desire, sex, love, and spirituality, to making pivots and transitions in life, and topics related to psychology, storytelling, gender and race issues, emotional intelligence, activism, advocacy, and much more. A few disclaimers. No episode of the show is meant for everyone, and every episode is meant for whoever needs it on the right day at the right time. Not all guest views will reflect my own, and that's intentional. We don't learn, grow, heal, or improve by staying in our comfortable bubbles with all of our people who look, think, or live exactly how we do. If you love what you hear and find it useful and inspiring, the best way to show your appreciation is to share the episode, subscribe to the show, and leave us a rating and review wherever you listen in from. Thank you so much for being here with me. Here we go. This is episode number 294 of Truth Telling with Elizabeth D'Alto, and this week's guest, Susanna Barkataki, had a big truth about how intimately interconnected wellness, healing, and social justice are. So we talked about dominant culture, how whiteness is upheld in yoga and wellness spaces, power dynamics and structures, people's capacity for discomfort and navigating the big emotions that come up when doing this kind of work, which are primarily sadness, grief, and anger. And Susanna provided a thorough examination of violence and nonviolence in 3 levels: self, interpersonal, and institutional. And this might have been my favorite point of the whole interview. It really helped me deepen my learning, and I hope it does the same for you. We also talked about how to dismantle and build at the same time, decolonizing our own minds, internalized oppression, trauma-informed yoga asana practice, and the nature of privilege. I also want to add a few notes on the summit Susanna is hosting that we mentioned in the interview, since I'm a guest for it. I usually don't say yes to online summits. I haven't said yes to one in years, but when Susanna invited me to be part of this one, I said yes because the topic is something that's really important to me. Even so, as I do not have the time to personally vet each speaker or listen to 20+ interviews, please be aware that my participation in this summit is not an endorsement for every speaker in the lineup, and it's likely that not all views of all the speakers are in alignment with my own. I do recommend that you use your own discernment if you choose to sign up for the summit, and be aware that the way these things work is you will receive several emails once you sign up and be invited to a Facebook group for discussion, which is totally optional and you don't have to participate if you don't want to. As well, since you all know clear communication is a very high value for me, I want to add that based on some of the messaging around this summit, it seems that though it's called Honor, Don't Appropriate Yoga, it's largely focused on diversifying Western yoga asana practice spaces just as much, if not more so, than addressing cultural appropriation within the Western yoga world. So all of those things said and included, sign up if it appeals to you, or don't. The show notes and links to everything are at untameyourself.com/294. And as well, just a reminder, there are 10 more Wild Soul Movement Weekend workshops going on throughout 2019, several in the United States, one in Canada, in Toronto in August, one in the UK in July, 2 coming up in Australia at the end of March and the beginning of April. So I'm going to be all over, and I'd love to meet you in real life. You can sign up for a workshop, check out the dates and locations at wildsoulmovement.com/workshops. And those are all my announcements for you today. Let's get into the show. All right, everybody. Today we have Susanna Barkataki. I said it right?
You said it right.
Yes. Susanna's with us, and this was another instance where someone else was interviewing me for something on their platform, and I was like, oh my God, I love this person. You must be on my show. So that happened recently. Actually, at the time you're hearing this, Susanna's Honor Yoga Summit is starting in just 2 days. And so, if you're listening to it in real time, you'll check that out. We'll give you links. It'll all be in the show notes and everything. This is episode number 294. So it's untameyourself.com/294. And I was so literally honored. Often you'll hear people say oh, it's such an honor. And it's kind of trite. But I was literally honored to be invited because the whole thing is about not appropriating yoga. And I don't know how Susanna had come across our platform or the podcast, but this is something I've been actively doing, is looking at all the ways I didn't know what I didn't know. So it was an actual honor to be invited to the conversation, not as an expert, just as a person who's actually doing that work and figuring it out as we go along. So thank you again for that, Susanna.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I've been asking everyone this year in 2019 to keep the focus on the core of what I do, which is embodiment. I've been asking everyone to start out their interviews just how's your body today? What's going on in your body?
My body is good. It's a little bit electric and zingy, and there's just beautiful clouds flowing by, and weather is changing around me in where I'm sitting in Orlando, Florida. And so my body feels alive and very vibrant.
Oh, cool. I love that. And then the other question we asked to start is, what is a truth that's having a big impact on your life right now?
Yes, I love that you're asking this question. And the truth that is having a huge impact on my life is I finally understood, right? Because I came to this work from social justice, and I've been doing a lot in yoga for the last decade and a half. And so, of course, they're connected, but the truth of how intimately connected wellness and yoga and healing and social justice is just has been really alive for me right now, this week, because I hadn't been making the connections. I have a cousin who was just a year or two older than me. And he, like many Indians, had issues of obesity and heart disease and, other complications that were going along with just a lack of knowledge around his wellness. And he passed away recently. And it's wait a second. If we're not connecting the dots of these practices that can help us stay well and help us heal with material conditions like survival for people who need it, then we're missing something. So that truth is wow, this is not frivolous. This is life or death.
This is an incredible point, and thank you. And I'm sorry to hear about your cousin. And, when you say the word materially, there's material, the physical body, the physical world, and then there's materialism. And as you were saying that, it was just dawning on me, which is something I'm excited to unpack with you, is the Western culture and appropriation and packaging and selling of yoga, which then becomes really inaccessible for a lot of people. And the Lululemon fancy tight show. And then that's a sweeping generalization. I'm saying it to be a little cheeky, but hopefully people listening get the point, and I know you do. Versus actually incorporating and integrating these practices in a vital way that can, like you said, literally be life or death.
Yes.
So what were you going to say?
Oh, just it's so important that we're making these connections, right? Because your listeners, my community, I think we're at this time where the shift is happening, where we're not actually ourselves filled up, by yoga or wellness tools or coaching that is devoid and empty of making these connections. It's just not working. It's like the self-care that's like, fill me up. But no, that's not enough, right? It has to be community care. It has to be interconnected.
Yeah, and there is such an interesting connection between like the collective work that needs to be done, but then also the personal responsibility, and how this always happens. I'm batching podcast interviews today, so often like one after the other, they totally piggyback on each other, and you don't know that because you didn't have the last conversation, but I do. And one of the things that came up,
there.
You're like, oh, I was there, girl. You just didn't know.
Energetically.
One of the things that came up in the last conversation I was having was like that wide scope of awareness, right? Being aware of what's going on in the collective, but then dialing in and going deeper with what is actually yours to do.
Yes.
So what is yours to do these days?
What is mine to do? Well, I love how you said that. It's definitely going broad and going deep. So my mission in the world really is to uncover myself and my identity and my gifts in the world, and to share that with others through yoga and through this journey of, a yogic practice is really using breath, is using mantra, mudra, ethics, all of these different tools, the physical practice, to peel back layers to our true selves. And so the more that I can do that for myself, the more that I am showing up to help and support others do that. And it's really apparent to me lately how I'm just so not alone and how interconnected I am. And it feels very, just at the end of 2018 and now in 2019, like this movement where in the past, those of us who were brown and doing yoga, there was room for maybe one on a summit or on a conference or, in a consulting gig. And so there was a little bit, in past years of like, not intentional competition, but, not like, hey, I'm calling up all my friends and bringing them along. And now it's happening. And so my role is also, because I do get access, I'm lighter skinned, I have some mixed privilege, right? And so because I'm Indian and British, and so my role is in part and I'm sweet, I get called in to these yoga spaces now. I'm just starting to get it after like 2 decades of work, which is awesome. But then my role is to be like, great, bring me and these 10 other people, these other people doing this work. And so to really be in collaboration and to invite people into a way to honor the practice of yoga that is truly theirs and also honors the tradition.
For anyone who might not have caught it, I want you to just explain why being sweet is something that gets you perhaps more invitations than those who are not perceived that way.
Yeah. Okay. So to talk about this, we have to talk about power, right? And systems of power. And so when there is a dominant culture, which in the United States and the West is white supremacy, right? Like the power holders, the ones who own and run the gatekeepers really are upholding whiteness, right? And so there's this whole other world that I know many of your listeners have been going on a journey with you to uncover and explore. My window onto it is being an immigrant, mixed race, right? Tons of violence that happened to me in particular, my family, because of being mixed, because of being specifically Indian in Britain where I was born, and then in the United States, that another person in yoga might not be aware of, right? And then knowing that my family had violence against them in India for practicing yoga under British colonization. So there's all this context of power and an imbalance of power. I'm putting my hands like one above the other. And because of that imbalance of power, sometimes it's hard when someone who hasn't had the power challenges those who have the power, right? And we're pissed, there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of suffering, and like just so much like uncontainable oceans of sadness and grief and anger that are so much for those in the dominant power positions to handle. And so not everyone can come in and be sweet while talking about these things. Some combination of my personal practice, I would say my yoga practice, and probably also my privilege has gotten me to a place where not all the time, but often I can be. And so because I can be sweet, it's easier for people in those positions of power to hear from me the things that they can't maybe hear because someone else they're going to say too angry or too radical or all those things. And I have been on a journey, I love what you talk about with like the untamed soul, right? My journey of just more and more truth telling, more and more speaking my truth, which is less sweet and is radical and is fierce. And yet there's something about someone called me in a position of power, sattvic, right? Which is like the pure quality, which is very nice and is a compliment, but I also understand it as a double-sided compliment because, what happens then when someone is super fiery and are they not going to talk to them then? Are they not going to hire them?
Well, yeah, like this idea of palatability and tone policing, right? So people might choose you because you're more digestible to them, which is like an expression of their own fragility, what they haven't unpacked and whatever. So this isn't necessarily like, it's good for you that you're being invited in, but it's not that reason being a reason. I just want to like presence. That's not a great thing that exists for the folks that are making the invitations. It's not going to be like, oh, who are we comfortable with?
Right, exactly. And so part of what my job, I feel like, is to help people get more comfortable, like kind of extend their boundaries of comfort. And sometimes that's by, gentle means, and sometimes that's like blowing it open. And I just have to gauge what is appropriate when. And I've also stopped. I used to care so much about what people thought of me. And I think to really be effective in the work that I'm trying to do, which, as I mentioned, is really, it's a life or death thing. Like, I don't freaking care anymore, like care. Sometimes it's going to be fierce.
Yeah. And, I appreciate this because I used to really think that I didn't care what people thought in like a pretty big way. And I noticed just in my own journey and evolution here with my own truth telling, it was much easier not to care when the things I was talking about weren't that triggering for folks. But once I started having conversations that were much harder for people to be with and hear, the response is different. And so increasing my capacity for discomfort and just like continuously like detaching from how people respond and prioritizing the responsibility over whether or not people are going to like it. That's part of it too.
Right. Coming back to, that's what I've had to really come back to is my values, my base, right? And those values of like, this is a healing justice issue. This is a social justice issue. This is really about like material conditions and change for people who haven't had access. And it's also a very personal journey, right? Of unification, of honoring. And really, if we're going to call ourselves healers and coaches and teachers and yogis, if we're not looking at the things that cause separation, how can we say we're doing yoga?
Yeah.
So when we come back to that, it's like it's a lot clearer.
Yeah.
For me. I hope that that's the invitation for folks who are in our communities as well.
Yeah. So you said you used the term violence earlier, and this is something else. As I've been doing this work, I've realized still my mind still goes there. When people say violence, often I'm immediately assuming like some kind of physical violence, some kind of physical harm, but violence extends far beyond the physical. So would you be able to just give us like a fuller definition of violence in the context of how you use the term?
Yes, absolutely. So I think of both violence and nonviolence on three levels. And those three levels are personal, like to ourselves, so violence against oneself could be anything from cutting to also not getting enough sleep, right? And actively overworking. Nonviolence would be self-care or getting counseling in that instance. Interpersonal violence, which is what we traditionally think of as violence, which is like what I experienced as a young girl growing up in a suburb of LA, which was a lot of physical violence against my actual body by white young men. And I had to fight back physically. So I am, learned to be a fighter. And that was interpersonal violence. Interpersonal nonviolence would be an example of, or care, an example of someone uplifting someone else, right? Or helping someone else get the support that they need, as opposed to harming them, to leveraging power to aid someone else. And then the third kind, which is the one that I think most people aren't aware of, both of violence and nonviolence, is either we could call it institutional violence or nonviolence, and structural violence and nonviolence. And all of these things are really deeply embedded in a yogic understanding, right? I learned this from studying Gandhi and the liberation movement that he really took from the Bhagavad Gita and from applying yogic principles into getting India free from British rule. So institutional violence is violence that happens when a power structure has systems, laws, economic policies, practices, cultural norms that are in place to give power to and privilege to a certain segment of the population and actively underprivilege and under-resource and underpower another. So for example, in India, that would mean, like when I was talking with villagers in Shimla in the north in a hill station, Indian villagers, they said, it wasn't that long ago. And people, it's so beautiful there. Like from this hill station, you can see the whole across the green fields of plains of the Gangetic Plain. And so one of the villagers said to me, when the British ruled here, like my father couldn't walk on the thoroughfare, the main road. And so that's institutional violence, right? It's not necessarily so easy to point out in that moment how that's violent, but he couldn't open a shop. He couldn't, go and get the help or the support from the British merchants that were in that hill station. So that's just one tiny little micro case study that impacted this villager in his whole life because of institutional violence. And so institutional nonviolence, this is where we get really profound, can happen in multiple ways, right? It can happen when an institution with power shifts to, again, materially lift up groups who've previously been under-resourced. And it can also happen when people take that power for themselves, like with the Me Too movement, like the Indians did in India in order to overthrow British rule, like Black Lives Matter, right? So, but the difference with Black Lives Matter, for just to be really clear, is we're still living in a white supremacist, police state. And so, though it's moving towards, or it is itself a movement of institutional nonviolence, it's still in a context of white supremacy. And so, until our government, our laws, our policing shifts, that we're still in a context of institutional violence. I hope that's clear.
It's super clear. And I actually was, as you were talking, I can listen and think at the same time. I think a lot of people, specifically women who have diffuse awareness in the brain, can. I was like, I didn't even know that she would have this 3-part, I was literally so glad I asked the question because you had such an amazing answer for it.
This is what I used to teach American culture through the lens of race, class, and gender to 11th graders for about a decade. And so this is, I realized it's like, wow, how did I come to do what I do, right? Yoga and social justice. Well, because I lived it, first of all.
Yeah.
I also taught it. I'm an educator, so I think about systems, and really, ultimately, I'm all about systems change, right? I'm invested in structural, nonviolent transformation.
Well, and this is something that I've come to understand as well as I've been doing my work and studying and educating myself, is that nothing will change sustainably and for real unless the system changes.
Yes. Yeah. And so for each one of us, right? So for folks listening, it's like, oh, it can feel really overwhelming. Like it's a system and I didn't create it and I'm just born into it. But my ancestor, it's like, what can we do? And I think that is so important. So I just want to offer like hope, because every single one of us actually has the ability to impact systemic change, right? And it may just be by saying, wow, I don't know that much about this. I'm going to go learn more. Or it may be by continuing to learn from teachers like you, from teachers like me, and many others, right? Like, just keep going and don't get disheartened, because it's really just people working together that create societal change.
And I always need to do this just in case this happens. Like when you say teachers like you, teachers like me, let me be very, very clear. I am not a race educator. I am not a social justice. Like I host the Truth Telling podcast. I teach embodiment and women's work, but I'm just super passionate about a lot of this is like selfish for me and my own learning and unpacking. But like we are both teachers of different things, but I am not the same kind of teacher as you. I'm just putting that out there to just be super, super clear, because there's much more qualified people than me to be learning about this stuff, like you, for example, which is why you're here. So one of the things I've noticed that a lot of people advocate for in order to, I've loved this actually. The systems, specifically here in the United States, the systems of oppression that are currently operating, white supremacy, patriarchy, all these things. It's not that the system is broken. The system is fine. It's actually thriving and it's working exactly how it was designed to work. So that's why step one needs to be dismantle. And I think that's part of me wonders if in our lifetime we'll live to see the creation of a new system. But so my perception from a lot of the people I follow and learn from is we have to actually dismantle and build simultaneously while also unplugging. Part of the dismantling is the unplugging. So I'm just tossing that out there, and I'm super curious as someone who knows much better than I would. Is there like a steps, a framework, an evolution of it? Does the question make sense?
It makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
And yes, I think you're absolutely right. It has to be dismantled and built at the same time. And I also feel like I searched long and hard, and I studied a lot of theorists in these things. And there are theories, but there are many ways that it can happen. And it is nonlinear and it is iterative, meaning that each one of us are unplugging and are decolonizing our minds, and then are understanding how to rebuild and how to fortify and how to act for good and justice and wholeness may look different. I can share mine with my process, which really was a lot about undoing internalized oppression. And by that I'll define it. I mean, in a system, right? We've been talking about these systems of power. In a system where one group is primatized, put as a priority, and others are lower. As a young brown girl growing up in California, I felt like I was ugly. I felt like I was unwanted. I felt like I was stupid. I should be quiet. There were so many layers that I had to unpack that had been internalized, right? And even to the point where there was a sense of that Indians are inferior, that, these words. I was actually reading an essay by a British I don't even know what role he was. He was like a researcher in India, but the Indian man is weak. He is feeble. He is, and they're not even talking about women. They're talking about men. And so, so all those messages had gone in. And so the way it started for me was unpacking the internalized oppressions, and then also connecting those oppressions to the bigger system. And when I did that, I was pissed, right? I went through a time of being super angry, and I'm mixed, right? I'm half white, I'm half Indian. So imagine, like, there's a whole complexity here because I'm both colonizer and colonized, right? And so undoing the inferiority, but then also not feeling hate towards the white folks or the whiteness in me, which from a spiritual, this is where I get spiritual, from a spiritual point of view, I believe I had to come to be able to get to that point, to then be able to step into my power as a healer. I had to integrate and get beyond shame and fear and guilt and inferiority or superiority, right? Because just flipping the script isn't going to help us either. And putting, folks of color above white folks, that's not what this is about. This is really about a kind of something that we dream about, but many of us have never experienced, and so it does take that visionary, future forward, kind of childlike wish. I talked to my 6-year-old. I have a 6-year-old boy named Kailash, and he sometimes is like, he just doesn't get it. He's like, why is this? Why do, Black kids get shot? Why do, like, he just has all these questions. He's like, this makes no sense. Why do people own guns? He just has questions, like, in this very innocent way that we all have that. We're all like, we have that future potential in us. We always did. And we just forget it, or it gets kind of beaten down. So coming back to that, I think, is a big part of those steps, and finding our allies, finding our sisters and brothers and friends who we can have these conversations with and be building the dreams and the visions with, because we're the ones, it's not, we can't wait. We can't say, oh, it's not my responsibility. It is. Like, it's on us. So let's join together and do it.
What I appreciate all of that. And the piece that I want to tug on and go a little bit deeper is, being mixed race is such a fascinating thing. And people on the podcast, like, this is one of my personal journeys and inquiries around, I'm essentially Italian and Puerto Rican, a little bit German and Irish, and confronting my own, I'm calling it my own whitewashing in my family, where the culture of the Puerto Rican side of my family gradually, like, diminished in my own household, right? So actually at the time of recording this, in a week, I'm taking my dad, who's the Puerto Rican one, I'm taking my dad to Puerto Rico to just go hang out with my family and be on their land and, like, get to know them more. Because, like, I obviously don't see them a ton. And as well, and build and create my own relationships, because a lot of my perception of them has come through, things my parents have shared over the years and, like, their experiences. And I'm like, I want to have my own relationship. I want to be in my own culture and let it be, this culture is part of me. This is in my blood. For many years that I wasn't connected to it, anytime I would hear, and this is how it's like, the soul knows, the body knows, right? If I would, any Latin music, I get emotional. I love it. Like, even before I knew how to dance, quote, right? Before I took any salsa lessons or Zumba classes, my body would just, like, want to move. And it felt like this internal struggle. It was like my body recognized the rhythm, but it was like, but I don't, it was such an interesting experience. So I put that out there because it's not in the context of, kind of like what you were saying, like the interpersonal and the personal. I'm going somewhere with this. I'm just rambling to get to my point. Sometimes I process out loud. I had to have this personal experience to actually also be able to understand how, when white people are feeling defensive or freaking out, that, like, their power is taken away. It's because they're not understanding. Like, no one's trying to take anything away from you. People are just trying to also like get on the level where everyone should freaking be. So it's the same within ourselves. When we have more than one thing, it's like, I'm not denouncing, because like something my mom will say to me, it's like, because I'll often just say I'm Italian and Puerto Rican, because those are like the two cultural influences that I felt growing up. She'd be like, are you denying your grandmother? Because my grandmother's the one who's German and Irish. And I'm like, I'm not, but I also get to spend a little more time in the part that was not really that represented for me growing up.
Right. Right. Yes. I think this is so profound, right? Like wherever we're from, we can explore into our roots. And we often hear, or I often hear white people say like, I have no culture, or, you know, your culture is so interesting or beautiful, whatever. But we all have culture, and some of it is just unpacking that colonization and removal, right? Because if whiteness is a norm, then it benefits whiteness to say, I have no culture, right? People can just assimilate who are German or who are French or who are Irish, or even who are, you know, some like Lebanese, or even from Iran until more recently. It's super complex, right? But there's all these layers. And race is an illusion. Race is a social construct. Whenever I say that, though, I always think of a line from a play that I love that says, just because race is an illusion and it's a construct, it still impacts like the people getting shot on the street, right? Like we created this illusion and we live out the nightmare of it, but we can also live out the dream of it, which is not available by just saying we are all one, or I don't see color, but that dream is available by exactly what you're saying, like looking at the complexity, going in, you know, I do. And I was born in England. I go back there sometimes to see my family, as well as going to India. And when I go to England, I'm always really curious about like the kind of religious pagan roots, right? Ley lines, spiritual centers. I'm hoping to go to Stonehenge. And this for me is like a way of me reclaiming those indigenous British roots and what even that means, you know, and I don't have all the answers. I'm in the exploration too, but I am very much in love with anyone who's willing to explore and go into that in their own life and their own kind of makeup, because it's so fascinating to hear those stories from our grandparents, or hear the rhythm in the songs, or the lullabies, or any of these practices or meals or recipes, right? These are all cues and clues that we can use to get more embodied in our own cultural stand, in owning our own power.
I love that you said that, because you have something, again, these things can feel enormous. A lot of the things that we're talking about in this conversation can feel so overwhelming and insurmountable. I can see why people would choose to like not even go there, because it just feels like so much. And I always encourage people, go there anyway. And so it's like, what are you interested in? Start there. So for me personally, I'm most interested in healing arts, in mysticism and magic. So when I look at the roots, I'm like, who are the shamans? Who are the medicine people of this tradition? Like, that's what I want to know from the roots. Some people, it might be food. Some people, it might be music or the dance of the culture, or like, you know, whatever. But the stories, the mythology, there's all kinds of places to start and then see where it takes you.
Yes. I love that.
So you said something earlier, and I'd love a definition on this too, because this is a big word, decolonizing. And actually, remember, I think, is Luna Love in your summit as well?
She's not, but I love her. And
I felt like you guys were connected in some way, so I couldn't remember if that was how. But when I had on the show last year, you know, she talked about decolonizing her mind. So in case anyone hasn't listened to that interview, can you define, like, what does that mean?
Yes. So decolonizing is a word that I used when I wrote in 2015 on Decolonizing Yoga. And what I was talking about then, and I want to be really specific and clear about this, what I was talking about then is the actual colonization of a people the British, right, colonizing India, which means taking over their cultural wealth, but also their land, their natural resources. And that we, in our time now, even though India is free of the British, we actually are not post-colonial. People like to use that term post-colonial, but we're still colonized because the West, the US, Britain, white folks essentially are still the ones controlling the narrative on this indigenous knowledge. So I was talking about that like kind of new wave of colonization that is in an information economy that is the colonization of ideas.
This is
now,
so brilliant. Sorry, keep going.
Yes. Now I want to complexify it. And I think it's very important that we complexify it because in the years since, I've become aware, and maybe it was, I'm sure it was happening all along. There's a huge movement around it because we're living in the United States. I'm on Seminole land in Florida, where decolonization is used by the indigenous Native American, decolonizing our world here. Like that movement is specifically about land agency, right? Mm-hmm. And so as a settler colonial, even though I was an immigrant and a refugee escaping ethnic violence and violence against me because of who I am in England, I was a refugee to the United States. It doesn't change the fact that I have settler privilege, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not indigenous to this land. And so when we're talking about decolonizing, there was a wonderful article put out saying that was all about how decolonization is not a metaphor. And so I just want to be really clear, and I use the term decolonization a little bit less now because Native folks are saying this is about indigenous land rights. And so I really respect that and I honor that. And I in no way want to undermine that. In fact, I'm in solidarity with that. And so I had to think long and hard about, well, yes, in an information economy, it's still not as concrete as what Native folks are talking about around like give us back our land. And so I now talk more about reclaiming or, honoring yoga's roots. And that point is still there, right? The colonization is still there, but I think there's probably better terms to use it. So by decolonize, I think it's important to look and like we've been saying, unpack our thoughts, but also to pair that with what are we doing materially to support folks whose land we're on who don't have agency and autonomy over that land.
Yeah, I appreciate that context. And this is we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to voice it because it came up organically, how challenging it is. And again, I'm always looking at making the lifelong commitment. How do we keep people in this work? And so not that I want to coddle anyone or make it comfortable, but I am interested in making it easier to stay in the work.
Yes, me too.
And so those are two different things, right? Like you don't come here to get comfortable. I think people know that about me. But I am looking for how can we make it easier for you to stay once you get here, once you are uncomfortable. And it goes back to something you were saying earlier about like, I think I wrote it down as increasing the capacity for discomfort, right?
Yeah.
So language becomes such a barrier because people are very, I want to say territorial. And I'm not saying this so this is also, just let me note, I'm processing out loud here. So like, don't hold me yet to anything that comes out of my mouth because I'm going to land on it and then I'm going to ask you for your opinion. So even, for example, being in the United States and Native American people kind of having a claim to the term decolonization, but then there's other contexts for things. I find this a lot in this work, how it's like you got to be careful about what words you use. I'll pull another one in to just give a different example, like the word liberation. Or even the word freedom, or even saying things like get free, right? Because some of that can seem to be appropriating from the Black freedom movement, from the civil rights movement back in the 60s. And it's like, yeah, but that's also like a word in our language that has other meanings too. So I throw all that into the cauldron to then ask you, how do you engage with all of that?
Yes. Well, I love it. And actually, in a lot of the work that I do now, the work of helping yoga studios, yoga teachers, different big organizations become more welcoming and inclusive, and just having a different kind of way of engaging with their clients or with their students, right? In a really welcoming and fun way. There's so much that's specific to using language, using marketing, using images that is actually representative of what they want to engage, right? Or what they want to actually say. And so for me, so much of this is really how we can become in greater and greater alignment. And as a yoga teacher in the yoga world, that word has a lot of meaning, right? We often mean alignment to be like, is your front foot lined up with your back arch or all those things. But I actually mean alignment with our yogic principles, with our values of ahimsa, like we were talking about, violence, and nonviolence, with our values of truth, satya, with all the different values that we may have, is our language, and our, not just our language spoken. I think a lot, and I'm sure you do too as an embodiment worker, like about the messages that aren't said, but that are communicated. Is all of that subtext, context, words, is it all in alignment with our true, deep, highest call, like ourselves, our business at its highest manifestation? And that is the work I love to do with people, is help them get that alignment. So there's not like a quick fix answer, because for one person saying get free may be absolutely like in alignment. And for someone else, they might say, oh, I realize like, that's not actually in alignment, and it's not really, that may be putting some people off, or it may be, co-opting another person's movement. And that's why when people say like, should I teach yoga? I'm white. Should I teach yoga? I can't answer that for you right off the bat. We have to go deep, and we have to have a conversation, and we have to look at different factors, and then only you can answer that question, right? And we go through a whole process.
This is why I asked how you engage with it, not what's the answer. And I think that's one of the things about these conversations and this topic, is that there are not necessarily a lot of the answers are going to come back to, okay, what's your context? What's your complexity? What's your practice? What's your devotion, discipline, commitment to these things? Because that's going to, and we talk a lot about intent versus impact, but where intent does really matter is what's your intention. You're just trying to make a career for yourself and fill your pockets. Well, that's a problem. Or is it like you actually have had personal experience that you are now devoted to this, and it's about bringing this into the, like, it's different.
It is. And the other piece is what you were saying about keeping people in the work. It's so joyful, right? It's so fun. It's so rich when we are actually uncovering these layers that just allow us to actually be in more alignment.
Yes.
Right? Fun. It's really like nourishing and sparky and it's just like, and that's what's on the other side of that discomfort.
Yeah.
If we can hold it, I feel like actually turning away from that discomfort creates more barriers between us and ourselves and other people. But when we can hold it, it's like we get into this whole world of relationship with self and others. It's so amazing.
Something I've judged myself, not harshly or badly, but just as like a weirdo, is as I've done this work, maybe because I see so much online, people talking about like how hard it is and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but to me, it's so worth it. It feels so good to be able to do things in a way that is not oppressive or as harmful to others. The humility, the accountability, and honestly, even the grief, Susanna, and I'm sure you can relate to this and a lot of people listening as well, it's heartbreaking to me to reflect back on how I have been and how I have shown up and things I have said to people and ways I have treated people because I just didn't know what I didn't know. Like, if I had known better, I would have done better, but I didn't. And it's like, and I can't change that. So I can't beat myself up about it. I have to grieve it, though. I have to grieve the former expressions of myself that just didn't know and, of course, caused more harm. And again, it doesn't mean that because I'm doing this work now that I'm not cause it. Like, I guess I just got pinged by a friend the other day, where I shared something and she was like, hey, I don't know if you noticed this, but like this, and this. And I was like, oh, thank you so much. And like, this is what I'm talking about. That feeling of being like, like I cried a little, not out of fragility, out of gratitude that it was a Black woman, took a moment that she didn't have to send me a DM, to point something out and to be like, yo, I see you. I know you're trying to do the right thing. I know your heart's in the right place. I don't think you see this. I'm not here to correct you. I'm just here to point something out because I think you would care. And I did. And it did. Like, it was so nourishing to my heart. And I was like, because it was like, cool, one more thing I could do better now.
Yes. Yeah, it's huge. And I actually, it's the nature of privilege, the places where we have privilege, to be blind to what we can't see, right? Mm-hmm. And so it is on other people sometimes in this really unfair way to wake us up or to open our eyes to the privilege that we're not even aware of. But then we have a choice, right? Like what you just shared. And there are white folks all across the country, all across the world, or people in privilege of all different kinds, like myself as a cis woman, where there are times where we, like, every time we say, oh, right, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize, like, it doesn't necessarily make it better, but it is a step in that direction of more inclusivity. And this is really huge in the yoga world around trauma-informed yoga. Really, trauma-informed yoga has to include diversity. It has to include, ableism being questioned. It has to include trans folks. It has to include, we're not just talking about trauma like childhood trauma or, an impact like a natural disaster. We're talking about systemic trauma. And that's a lot of the things we're talking about today. If our yoga is not trauma informed in that way, or our coaching or our healing or our, anything that we're doing that is in this realm of helping one another be better and grow, it has to include all of it. And it is okay to just keep going and messing up. Like, I messed up this week too. Yeah. Around something ableist, which, I'm disabled. It's like I'm blind in one eye. And I said something that was like a slur, using something about not being able to do something that was a slur around ableism. And so we're just always learning. And I was lucky enough to have someone call me out on it in a gentle way and then own it.
Yeah. And that's also something I'm detached from. I don't need people to call me out. I'm not saying you do. I'm just speaking to this point. I don't need someone to call me out in a gentle way either. Someone could be a total asshole to me. Don't care. If I transgressed, I'm just grateful that you let me know. I do ask kindness. It'll land probably better if it is delivered with kindness, but I also just don't care. That is something I've actively detached myself from. Been like, it's cool if you want to take the time to like have your own feelings and then be able to come to me with kindness and compassion to let me know. But if you're just pissed and you want to bring that too, great. Because like, I'm never going to tell someone not to have feelings. And this is actually, I'd love your opinion on this. This is something I talk to, I have a bunch of friends who are also unpacking and doing this work in their businesses. And I'm not into tone policing. And
right. There
is also a difference between tone policing and abuse.
Yes.
And this is part of being trauma informed, right? Yes. And also, doing healing work around emotional intelligence and maturity and development. And there are ways of talking to people that I don't care what your tone is, but I do care if you're actually being abusive to people. Mm-hmm. And that's been an interesting thing to navigate in terms of even people who I invite on the show, whose work I can share and feel in alignment with my own values. I'm not saying their work is wrong. I'm just saying personally, because that's just another factor. Abuse is another factor. Trauma is another factor. So like, even though the world at large is safer for white people, it doesn't mean like that white woman who had emotional and physical violence in her life isn't also having a moment when a person of color speaks a certain way that has nothing to do. Yes, there's like racism involved, but also that person has their own trauma that is also still valid. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So
yes, it's huge.
I'm just curious, your opinion, how you see that showing up or not. Like, the trauma informed is something I'm also super passionate about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am in exploration on this. I feel like I'm still very curious and kind of a student of this whole understanding, because the way it's been landing for me is because of systemic trauma, right? When we talk about racism or like colonial oppression, someone may have a response that is a trauma response that comes off as interpersonally abusive, right? But it's because of the systemic injustice. And so then I have to decide in that moment interpersonally if, because I understand the broader context, what I'm going to do with that. And it's very, again, I think it's very case by case.
Yeah, I agree with you.
A lot of what I teach in the yoga teacher trainings I teach is around boundaries, right? And around holding a strong container. And we really learn to do that because we have to as healers. And so there are certain times where if someone is speaking to me in a way that interpersonally registers as verbally abusive, it doesn't matter to me that I can see the institutional trauma that caused it. I will not tolerate it.
Yeah.
Interpersonally. And I will have compassion. You know, the difference is I don't like shame them or punish them or whatever.
I think this is actually a big part of it. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
In the response. Sorry, I'm noting the point as you go. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll have compassion for all the things that have created that trauma, but I won't interpersonally allow it to then like diminish me or get poured on me, right? And so that's been newer learning. I think there's a lot of unpacking around just being a woman, being Asian, that I've had to do to get to the point where I'm like, no. And that no can sometimes, it's actually for me, it's often just silence. It's just no response. Like a troll, whatever, you know, I get, because of the work I've done ever since 2015, I've been getting for years now, I've been getting hateful emails or, you know, on social media from all sides, like every direction you could imagine. I'm sure you get some too. And so often, instead of explaining, instead of justifying, I will just not respond. And that for me is, and I do it as much as I can with love, right?
Yeah.
Like the silence is encased from my side with like, I see the suffering. Because again, this gets to, and this is personal, like for me, this is about spiritual connection, right? And spiritual growth. So ultimately, if I respond in a traumatized way, or if I allow them to dominate me, I'm actually just perpetuating that cycle of harm.
Yes.
But if I can respond in a way that is either unplugging from that cycle or just changing way, I may be also inviting them into transformation.
Yeah. And you know what? This is such a great point. I wrote something recently. I was like, I've been getting real heavy handed with that block button on all of my communication apps. And part of that is, and again, here's nuance and complexity. So I think we spoke about this in my interview on your summit. When someone did something harmful, for example, a lot of people listening here will be familiar with Danielle Laporte. There were 2 instances in 2018 where her words that she used, whether in her marketing or on her Instagram, were harmful to Indigenous people and people of color. And people were like, ouch, that hurts. Please don't say or do that. Here's why. And she erased them. And so that is that erasure, right? And so then, for example, someone yesterday on one of my posts like gave me some like unsolicited piece of feedback. It wasn't race related or anything like that. It was more related to like my own spirituality and processing. And at first I like responded, and then 2 seconds later I was like, nah, forget it. I just deleted and blocked the guy. And there's a difference because he was coming into my space giving me an unsolicited opinion about something that I shared that wasn't like causing him any harm. Right? Versus when you erase someone who is saying to you, ouch, that hurts, that's violent, you're causing me harm, and you erase that, big difference.
Right. Yes.
And this is like, this is the first time I've actually even articulated it. So what you said, this is important. It could be, so me just like blocking and deleting that guy, it was me like unplugging. But then I did make a snarky comment about it because the whole post, it was like meant to have a sense of humor. So also, again, a different layer of a thing. Context matters. But like what
Right.
you're saying, we could just delete people. Someone DMs something nasty, I just literally don't have to respond. Versus the people who were like, hey, that thing you said, that was really insensitive. And I can be like, not responding to that is me being fragile.
Right. Yes. And I think so much of these choices that we make, so many of these choices have to happen in self-awareness
Yeah.
of our positionality,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Because in one situation, you're in a position of, privilege, maybe even power, and the person writing to you is not, and is asking you to look at your power and privilege. Whereas in this other one, you're in a position of vulnerability, of honesty, of sharing of yourself as a woman, right? Like, and then you get someone coming in that then is, to me, that's entirely different. That's just a different thing. So doing that work to always be aware of, what we don't know, and also be aware of where we stand in relationship to others, not in a way to separate, but in a way to better honor the connection.
I love that. I appreciate the couple places in this conversation where we've touched on the power dynamics or who's in the dominant position. Because again, like we all embody various identities, some of which have dominance and some of which do not.
Yeah.
So fascinating. I love this stuff. So we have just a couple minutes left. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to make sure we close a loop, or something that you wanted to share that we didn't get to?
Yes, I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm so excited to just continue this work. And I feel like I actually have a question for you, right? Which, in your particular positionality and the work that you do you feel like there are keys or trends or things that, and actually I think it's okay to ask about trends in this moment, because are there things that are making it more effective to do this kind of work that you are seeing from the place where you sit?
Yeah. So specifically from the place where I sit, being a person who toes a couple of different industries, which would be the online marketing space, self-help / personal development / spirituality / wellness space, because of some of the things that have happened over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, even like conversations around Marianne Williamson running for Congress, the stuff with Danielle Laporte, some people who have been in high visibility in these industries almost like falling from grace or having missteps, and seeing how some people have handled things beautifully with accountability and some people haven't. I think that this industry, these couple of industries are open in a way that, unfortunately, I think what's opened some people up is the fear of being the next person to fall from grace. But I don't give a shit, because I don't care, because they're listening, they're paying attention, and they're also realizing, something that I've said a couple of times, this kind of goes with like the Time's Up and Me Too, is like we're actually living in an age of rising accountability is how I've been describing it. Where actually, whereas it was easier before, to go back to what we were saying earlier, it was easier before to pretend that transgender people didn't exist. It was easier before to just make racist jokes and not have to worry about people being like, excuse me, can't say that anymore. It was easier before to be a man and like jerk off in front of women and like nothing was going to happen about it. But we're living in an age of rising accountability. And I think that is making it easier for the people who don't necessarily have the power or aren't necessarily in numerous dominant positions, cis, white, male, we know what a lot of them are, education, money, to be able to speak up and stand for themselves and go, hey, it's actually not as easy to push me down as it used to be.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there is still so much work to do, but I think this rise in accountability, which, to be honest, this is why I also say that social media is both a miracle and a dumpster fire.
Right.
That's the paradox.
Yes.
Because a lot of it wouldn't be possible without social media. Sorry, keep going.
Oh, no. It's just, I've been seeing this even with the summit that I'm putting on, right? And part of why I did it was to counter the narrative of like you get summit after summit in yoga. And of course, I know you're familiar with in the business development, women's leadership, coaching industry as well. And it's like white face after white face after white face, maybe one black, one brown, right? And yoga too. And it's like, wait a second, where are the South Asian leaders? Where are the Black women who are leading this charge in the United States? And so the thing that I struggle with actually is like, even in putting together the summit, I've seen those dynamics play out with who said yes, who didn't, who was too busy. And so I wonder sometimes about like that call out culture and how much to do that in order to further finally we are going to see a summit with a ton of Black and brown people leading the way, talking about Indigenous practices. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So excited for everyone to hear this.
Yeah. So speaking of which, and to wrap up on that, thank you very much. What is the website that people can go to see the summit?
So it's Honor Don't Appropriate Yoga. And
.com.
You can also, .com, honordon'tappropriateyoga.com. And they can also find it through my website, which is susannabarkataki.com.
Great. And we'll put those links will be in the show notes. Like we said earlier, this is episode number 294. So that's at untameyourself.com/294. And I'll tell you all, like the reason I even have Susanna on and like we bumped up, I swapped her with someone else's is I want you all to check out that summit. And I say no to 99.9% of summits. We get invites all the time. And the reason I say no is because I don't have the time to vet all the speakers. Mm-hmm. But with this one, because of the topic and because of the nature, I was like, it's okay. Just go. Yeah. But also, don't let your fragility be the thing that is influencing your resonance. So I want you all to go check that out. I also really appreciate the interview. Some of you have heard me mention many, many, many times in the podcast, especially if you've been listening for years, how the Hindu goddess Durga was pivotal in my journey. And Susanna and I had a really great conversation about something I'm an inquiry around with that, something related to the card in the Oracle deck where I use Durga for the visualization, that Sally Kempton book that I've recommended to so many people, Awakening Shakti, and just realizing whether or not some of the things that I've done have also been culturally appropriative. So we're unpacking some really good stuff in that conversation. And I'm actually also myself excited to tune in to some of the other conversations that are in that summit. So definitely go check that out. We'll put everything in the show notes. Susanna, thank you so, so much. Enjoyed this so much, and we'll see you later.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Slow process. It's a beautiful process, but it doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen easily. And if you're somebody who experiences this other thing that I call the wave, which is like when you find that someone is actually decent, available, and interested, that all of a sudden they become like 50 times more boring to you.
This happened to me recently.
Oh, yeah. Then a part of you should celebrate because you probably just found somebody available. And here's what you do. I'll tell you the two things you don't do, which comprise what you do do. The two things you don't do are you don't run. You do not get out of Dodge. The other thing you don't do is push yourself to be any more intimate than you want to be.